in a tiny art gallery in Venice, California.
The first time the Eagles played was at an art opening for Boyd Elder, our friend from Texas. Joni Mitchell and Mama Cass and David Geffen was there, Ned Doheny. There was, you know, the whole gang. Everybody was dancing in this wet, you know, concrete floor with beer all over it, and the Eagles were standing there playing Witchy Woman sort of over and over again.
Ooh, witchy woman, see how high she flies.
We only knew about 7 songs, so we played the same 7 songs over and over.
Woman, she got the moon in her eye.
It was fun. Joni was dancing.
They were the apex of the California sound. It expressed the sunshine and the warmth. They were the core of it. A magical combination of people who could create their material, who could pick the best of other people's material, and roll it up again in one of those fairy-dusted musical packages.
Well, I'm running down a road trying to loosen my load.
Helped by J.D. Souther and Jackson Browne, the Eagles wrote songs that would become emblematic of 70s LA. But not everybody was thrilled by their carefully crafted brand of country rock.
Take it easy, or let the
Their take on how to do it is to reproduce the record every time perfectly note for note. And it works for them. You know, it makes a good show for the crowd, but to me, it's boring.
take it easy.
They take no chances, ever.
Well, I'm standing on a corner.
The Eagles' reward for leaving nothing to chance was a hit album and 3 #1 singles.
It started in the 60s. We had a problem with the word commercial. And everybody said, we don't want to be commercial. Because commercial is like the Monkees, you know, it's like the Turtles. And commercial meant success.
If you're for the sake of the audience, you're the Monkees.
We may lose, we may win.
When we got together, we stated the intention. This band is about doing really well, becoming famous, and making a lot of money. That was our goal.
It was a goal that they achieved with their debut album, confirming the denim-clad, long-haired Western troubadour as the new image of mainstream commercial success. The Eagles' next record was once again written and conceived with the help of Jackson Browne and J.D. Souther.
When Jackson turned 21, I gave him a book called The Album of Gunfighters. There were the bodies of slain outlaws in it. John Wesley Hardin's shotgun-riddled body, and it was great. You know, there's underneath, there'd be a paragraph. You could read about how all this happened. And in a way, it sort of became the template for that Desperado record.
They were dueling Dalton. High or low, it was the same.
The notion of the cowboy, you know, when these wild, taciturn heroes stepping into a saloon and changing everyone's lives forever with a single shot or with a comment. It's a mythological moment that caught on.
On Desperado, the Eagles invented a collective identity directly inspired by their country roots and by the ultimate American fantasy.
As young guys 100 years ago, rather than being rock and roll guitar players, they might well have been, you know, rock and roll gunslingers. Certainly would have been carrying guns instead of guitars. So we decided that we'd do this Western motif shoot way out in the Malibu hills. It was almost like a time warp because it really did feel like we were back in the 1800s. It was so real. And the guys would come running down the street, you know, with their guns blazing and the eagles, and they would, you know, it was very heroic.
In the 60s, LA's singer-songwriters had portrayed themselves as heroes of the counterculture. The Eagles had recast themselves as fictional outlaws, an escapism that marked a timely disengagement from the political world around them.
I am an outlaw. I was born an outlaw's son.
There can be no whitewash at the White House.
Richard Nixon is the president. Valiums were on the rise. People were taking downers just to anesthetize themselves against the reality of this rightist regime that was going from Vietnam to Cambodia with napalm. What that did to music was, I think, for any person who wanted to be a player and continue, was to stop bitching, to shut up. What's in now is songs of consolation that can be marketed in the greater reality of a Republican regime. The songs were more handsome and a mile wide and an inch deep.
But the Eagles' Western escapade was a commercial flop. They would be forced to rethink their country roots and reinvent their cowboy image. And there was more bad news from their record company.
Steve Ross, who ran Warner's in those days, came to me and said that he wanted to buy it. And he offered me $7 million for it, which at the time seemed like a staggering amount of money. And I had watched Sonny and Cher go from the biggest act in the world to nothing, and Otis Redding die in a plane crash, and I thought, gee, $7 million, that was just such a huge number. I mean, it ended up being worth so much more money than I sold it for, but, you know, I'm doing okay.
Geffen and Roberts' management, our management, comes to us, and our record company as well. And they say to us, we've sold Asylum Records to Warner Brothers, and we're splitting up the management company, and so you guys have to find new management. And we're like, what?
Geffen continued to manage Asylum Records, now owned by Warner Brothers. But he would be forced to hand over the Eagles' personal management to another formidable hustler, Irving Azoff.
The first thing I think Irving did was turn around and sue Geffen for conflict to get the Eagles publishing back from Warner Brothers Music.
You know, in success, people feel like they're entitled to more, forgetting that when they made these deals, they had nothing, and nobody was interested in them.
When Warner Brothers merged Asylum with Elektra Records, another independent label it had purchased 2 years earlier, it signaled a shift in the tone of LA's record business.
And the change was that more and more managers were coming to the party. The lawyers were getting involved. When it became more business and less music, I left.
What's happening in the process, which I served gladly, is the corporatization of rock.
I mean, the music died around the middle 70s, at least in terms of everything that defined LA a decade earlier. If you go back to the Strip in the late 60s, there was a kind of utopian dimension. And I guess we were so carried away by that spirit that people failed to see how much of it was also about carrying people forward into, you know, Tower Records or into a whole brave new world of consumption in which, you know, rock and roll was simply the soundtrack.
In an increasingly corporate climate, the social scene was also moving, away from bars like the Troubadour to a more exclusive class of nightclub.
Among the clients that we had was a guy named David Blue, who was a friend of ours and a friend of Joni's, etc. And we had booked all of our biggest acts into the Troubadour, and I called Doug Weston and asked Doug Weston to put David Blue in there, and he wouldn't do it. And I said, look, I've given you Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young and the Eagles and Jackson Browne and Joni Mitchell and Linda Ronstadt, etc. I want you to play David Blue. And he said, I'm not going to play David Blue. And I said, if you don't play David Blue, I'll start a club. And he said, you think you can start a club? I said, a club? Yeah, I think I can start a club. And if you don't put David Blue in the Troubadour, I will. And he said, fuck you, do it. So we did.
The Roxy represented a new kind of Sunset Strip venue, in which the Eagles and their entourage found themselves at the center of an exclusive elite.
All of a sudden, there was an awful lot of money, a lot of celebrity, a lot of, you can come in here, you can't.
In their songwriting, the Eagles had begun to chronicle the mid-70s hedonistic lifestyle of which they were the prime players.
The summer after the fourth album, I left. And for a long time, I felt like I couldn't talk about it, partly because it had to do with my own personal drug use and too much partying, and I needed to get away from it, And when I left, the whole acoustic, bluegrass, folk, acoustic guitar thing went away.
Bernie Leadon was replaced by guitar hero Joe Walsh, as the Eagles ditched their acoustic roots and followed the musical drift towards stadium rock.
Was there a definite point in the 70s at which you realised that many of your contemporaries had lost touch and become too self-satisfied and smug about their own positions?
Well, I realized that about myself, but I didn't make any judgments on the rest of us.
In 1974, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young embarked on a world tour, the extravagance of which clashed wildly with the morality of their songs.
We had 85 people on the crew. We had helicopters, jets, limousines sat in front of the hotel 24 hours a day. I mean, it was just a exercise in excess.
You're at the top of the charts. Everybody loves you. You've got enough women to satisfy you for years. You have enough money and the ability to buy the best drugs, and it takes over, and it took over.
I mean, from my perspective, these were the guys that were talking about freedom. They were talking about justice. They were talking about respect for Mother Earth. They were talking about getting back to the garden. It was very hard to make sense of it all.
All of them represent to me the liberal Hollywood concepts. They favored money, and they just forget that sometimes, that it walks this thin line. But ultimately, it was about being successful.
By 1975, LA's once politically conscious musicians were consumed by cynicism, a mood fueled by a substance that had replaced marijuana and acid as Hollywood's drug of choice. One of its earliest advocates and biggest casualties was David Crosby.
David had bowls of it, big wooden bowls of cocaine, and he walked around stark naked with his pudgy little belly, and it was different. It felt okay. It felt all right in like 69, 70.